Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is listening beyond the soundbites. Joining me tonight is a new co-host that I'd like to introduce you to, Linda Sullivan.
Thank you.
Yeah, nice to have you with us.
It's my
Linda's
pleasure.
also a board member on Campaign for Vermont, which, as you know, I'm part of. And we're in a little bit of relationship with the show and with Campaign for Vermont, so we'll keep you busy. My guest, two guests tonight, is Larry Crist, who's you're Executive Director for the Vermont Parent Representation Center, which we'll talk about in a minute. And also joining us remotely on Zoom is Commissioner Bill Young, former Commissioner of the Vermont Department of Social and Rehabilitation Services. Bill Young, hello.
Hello, glad to be here.
That's some title you've got. Didn't I used to call it something else?
Actually, there were a number of things they called me while I was in the job.
Yes, exactly. But we won't say that on camera. Anyway,
Right.
let me ask Linda for just a moment to introduce herself to you as well.
Well, it's a pleasure to meet you. I'm Linda Sullivan. I currently represent Bennington Rutland in the House. This is my last term. It'll be 6 years. And I'm moving forward and stepping aside for someone else to take over. I'm a CPA. I do forensic work and a lot of receiverships. And I look forward to working with Pat and the board members.
Which might help you on this report. Anyway, the reason Larry and Bill have joined us this evening is they have put out an incredibly powerful and, may I say, disturbing report that you and you should know about and you'll be hearing about as well. You also work not only with Bill, but co-authored Trina Beck,
Yes.
and obviously Bill Young. And Larry, maybe we can just jump in. It's about how the Department of Human Services has people put on the Vermont Child Abuse Determination, the Child Protection Registry. We're going to let you explain that. Why don't you talk a little bit about your background and then about this report and how it came to be?
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah,
and thank
please.
you for having me on the show. It's nice to meet you, Linda.
Same here.
And nice to meet you, Commissioner. The report is really the culmination of a 2.5-year project, an experiment, if you would. And I hate to use that word, but that's pretty much what it was. Because the department, the state, in the presence of the Department for Children and Families, is charged with investigating alleged abuse and neglect of children. And it's one of the most serious powers, if you could describe it that way, the state government has, because there's a huge responsibility to protect children. And at the same time, there's an equal responsibility to make sure that investigations and determinations of whether someone has abused or neglected children are correct. So there is this process that is called the substantiation process. And if one is substantiated or found guilty, if you would, of abuse or neglect, then that person, after they've exhausted their appeal rights, are placed on what's called the Child Protection Registry. And this is, it's a list of all of the people who've been substantiated, and with a determination of how long they have to wait on that list until they can ask for expungement, if you would, to be taken off the list. However, being on the list is incredibly serious, because if you are on the Child Protection Registry, you're precluded from about 30% of all of the jobs in Vermont. And those are any jobs that relate to children, education, child care, medical care, as far as that goes. And so it's the responsibility of the state to maintain a system that's accurate, that is fair, that identifies people who are abusers, and absolves people who have been thought to maybe be abusing, who are not found to be abusers.
Right.
And what our study showed is that the system is broken. It just doesn't work the way it is supposed to. And in part, it's because it's an antiquated system. It's been around a long time. It hasn't been updated to reflect the power that goes now with being on that registry. And our study was designed to say, does the system work? Can it determine whether someone has abused or neglected children or not? And I'm sorry to say that the answer is no.
Right.
So,
And this, if I remember correctly from our discussion, this registry didn't start out as a checklist for employers. It wasn't intended for that. It was more intended for an internal information, perhaps.
yeah, it was really what you could refer to.
correct.
Yeah.
It was a red flag system, if you would, and the only people who had access to it were people in the Child Protection Agency, SRS
Right.
at the time. And it was used to determine whether the state should issue a foster care license or a child care license.
Right.
Because no one has a right to a license. You have the right to apply if you want, but you don't have the right to a license. So you didn't have to have initially the kinds of due process rights that the Constitution requires when you have a liberty interest or a property interest.
Right.
The legislature, in its wisdom, decided that employers should have access to that list as well. But the legislature apparently didn't realize that when you shift to that kind of a system where a person can be precluded from working, from even volunteering in a school,
Right. Right.
that you have to have other safeguards put in. You have to have a system that's based on evidence. The original system was based on information.
There's a concept.
Yes. So, but it's important to realize that with the original system, because it didn't involve any rights, the state did not have to have evidence. It just had to have a lot of information that would cause someone to say, maybe we shouldn't give this person a license. Now, that same system is based initially on just information. You're substantiated, you have an appeal process, but the state then has to produce the evidence. And that's part of the conundrum here, because we have two standards that people are judged by. At the first stage, they're judged by what's called a reasonable person standard. It's just information. But when they appeal to the Human Services Board, it is a much higher standard of evidence because they're precluded from work and other activities. And the two systems don't work in tandem with one another. So it's caused a lot of confusion. It causes people to be on the registry who really shouldn't be there. And what we also found is that because the investigations are not of a certain standard to produce evidence, it is quite likely that people who should be on that registry are not.
Whoa. So we're going to have a long
I think
talk
if
this
I could-
evening. Yes, please, Bill, go ahead.
If I could jump in for a minute, initially the registry was put in place, the federal government, and it was connected to funding at the time, that the federal government pushed the states to develop a registry of child abuse and neglect as a way just of tracking by state and making comparisons and for the country what was going on in terms of trends in child abuse and neglect. That was the reason it was put in place. They pushed the states to use the reasonable person standard, and most of the states did, as Larry was just talking about. But by now we're only one of 4 or 5 states that uses it, because states realize that it's not a standard. It's a standard without any boundaries. It basically says a reasonable person would think this is child abuse and neglect. So I could present a case for all 4 of us and say, is this child abuse and neglect? And Pat, you could say, oh, of course it is. And the other 2 of you could say, oh, no, it's not. And we'd all be right, because we're all reasonable people. So there's just no boundary to it. And as time has gone on, there's been, the registry has changed. We used it, as Larry said, it was confidential. And I told employees, if you disclose that somebody's on the registry, you will probably be fired, because it must be confidential. The thinking was, if it becomes public that a parent has been found to have abused their child, that publicity could result in discrimination and harm, both for the parent and the child. Kids, I certainly know about kids who it's been known that they were sexually abused. And, you know, eighth graders can be pretty cruel. And they're can be subject to a lot of teasing, and certainly it's a problem for parents. So the thinking was, you know, we don't want this to become something that makes it more difficult to work with a family or to help kids. And I think that's still true, but of course, you wind up with a few instances where, for example, somebody who is in the registry for sexually abusing a child is working in a school and molests a kid. You really can't, I couldn't, when they were considering, you know, making it more public, or access to employers that you know, where there's children around. It's hard to argue that one. I couldn't argue it.
Right.
The problem is, though, it's so broad that now you can have, they're putting everybody in the registry that's substantiated. So, you know, if you're a single mom, probably in the registry, maybe for questionable reasons, mostly struggling with issues of poverty, you're in the registry and subject to the same inability to get a job or getting fired as somebody who's molested 8 5-year-old children. You know, there's no reason for putting, given the fact that it's such a property interest of jobs and can cause so much harm, there's no reason to put everybody on, including people that you know, somebody's a cook or a cook's assistant somewhere, you know, in an organization where sometimes there are children visiting. You don't get hired, or you get fired if you're on the registry. It makes no sense. And now, coupled with what Larry's finding, that there are so many cases where that substantiation process is improperly used, evidence is skewed. We've seen cases where it's not just skewed, there's actually lies submitted as part of a substantiation process. A system that has these kinds of systemic problems in every county of the state. The registry is one of many problems that poses, and it really needs to be changed, as well as correcting the kind of abuses that are occurring. Some of them, Pat, I know you've read this report.
Right.
Some of them are unbelievable. When I first worked with Larry, I didn't believe it. And I said so. And then I made the mistake of saying, prove it. And he said, all right, when do you want to start?
Wow.
And over a period of months, and then just about every week for the last 4+ years, he's proved it to my satisfaction. These stories may sound unbelievable, but you better believe them because they're true.
Right.
And it's just unacceptable.
I actually read the report twice because, like you, I actually had to read it twice to understand it all. It's just really disturbing, to say the least. And I'd just like to know how did both of you, or maybe it was Larry, how did you know to do this? I mean, how did you know there was a problem? Was it that obvious and they're not paying attention?
It actually began when I took this job and started working with families, would be present when there would be a first interview or part of an investigation where DCF was involved, the Department for Children and Families. And I would watch the interaction, and then I would see later that this person had been substantiated, and I went, I don't understand this, because I didn't see anything here that showed me that there was abuse and neglect. There were problems, but they didn't rise to that level. So we did our first report in November of 2018, where we identified system-wide about 60 issues in the child protection system, much bigger than just DCF, because remember, this is a systems problem. It's not a person problem, and it's not even really a single department's problem. It's a system that we have created in this state over many decades frankly, without testing it. And that's what this project was designed to do. I felt like, when was the last time anyone really tested the substantiation registry system? And what I discovered is it didn't seem like anyone ever had. So we began looking at the data to see how many people actually are substantiated. It's between 700 and 1,000 people a year, every year in and year out. And the numbers are almost always the same in the percentages. Of the 700 to 1,000 people, only a third appeal their substantiations. And that was one of the questions. Why? Why do only a third of the people appeal? And then I began to look to see, at the first stage of their appeal, it's an informal administrative review. Only about 10% of the people won their appeals at that level. The next level is with the Human Services Board. Very few people appeal to the Human Services Board for a variety of reasons. But less than 1% of the people are successful with their appeals. So I said, working with my board, let's do a test of the system. Let's take the first 15 appeals that come to us. We won't select them. We won't screen them. If a person contacts us, we'll ask them, have you been substantiated? If the answer is yes, we say, have you completed your appeal process? If the answer was no, we said, well, we would like to work with you if you'd like to work with us. So you can't even say this is random sampling because it just is whoever came to us.
Right.
Now, one person once told me, well, maybe it's just because only innocent people came to you, Larry. And I said, well, that's a possibility, I guess, but I don't think that's what happened. So we took the first 15 appeals, and frankly, I hoped that we would lose them all. Because if we lost the appeals, it meant that the system was working. And what I found was just the opposite happened. We kept winning every appeal.
Wow.
So we got to the end of 15 appeals, and we had won 15 appeals. And we either won them outright in hearing, or the state withdrew the charges. The end result was the same. The person was not substantiated. They had been, the substantiation was undone. I still felt there was something wrong, that at the end of 15, no organization, no individual wins every appeal that they take. So we said, let's add 5 more, because maybe we are just on a lucky roll here. The next 5 appeals all turned out the same way. We won those 5 appeals. And I still didn't believe in the data, so we said, let's add 5 more.
Wow.
So eventually, what was supposed to be a 15 appeal test turned out to be, at this juncture, a 32 appeal test with about 27. And the reason I'm saying about is because we've had a couple overturned, and I haven't gone back to look at the numbers yet. So we have either now won 27 or 28 out of 27 or 28 appeals. That then caused us to say, we don't really need to see any more. We should write the report at this point because we've gone through a lot of experience. And what we discovered is what is in the report, that there really is no part of this system that works properly. The investigations don't work properly. And in large part, it's because the investigators, as Bill mentioned, they're looking at this from a reasonable person perspective, not from is there evidence or not evidence. Then the next phase of that is your original appeal with the Department for Children and Families, where the review officers who review your case are really locked into the same standard. Would a reasonable person say that this happened? They're then in a position of saying, okay, I'm a reasonable person, but then so was the investigator. And they thought it was reasonable, so why do I think they're unreasonable? That's really what happens in this process. Then we followed those appeals to the Human Services Board. And that's where a lot of our information came from, where we found that the investigations, an investigative report would say that X, Y, and Z was found. We would go in and reinvestigate and find that X, Y, and Z wasn't there. Or they would say, this is the situation, and it would look really terrible, until you would find another piece of evidence which told you that the child, teenager, later recanted in a very credible way to their therapist. The therapist informed the department, this person is recanted, and I believe them. There was never any evidence to begin with. It was just the testimony of the child. And then we find that, that in the review process, the recantation either was never put in the records or was purposely left out of the records.
That's really disturbing.
And that became very disturbing
Right,
to see
right.
that. And it didn't happen just once. It has happened more than that. And part of it, though, is because the investigators are under a lot of pressure. If they make a mistake and they leave a child in a home
Right,
and something happens, then first of all, it's a terrible thing for the child.
Right,
And frankly, it's a terrible thing for the worker. And then it becomes a terrible thing for the department.
right.
So we couldn't find a piece of this system that actually worked. And when we got to the Human Service Board level, we thought, okay, this is a fairer arena to do this in. But when you appeal to the Human Services Board, it's a whole nother game there. And what I mean by game is the Human Service Board operates under the Vermont Rules of Evidence. I've been doing this for 6 years now. I still don't know the rules of evidence. I doubt seriously that anyone
Not me.
here can say, I know the rules of evidence. Yet the department is represented by the Attorney General's office.
Right.
They know the rules of evidence.
Now, you didn't mention, I know at least in the appeal process, and maybe Bill, there's a lot of money that these people are spending to go through this process, right?
What
I mean, you
we
were
have
talking-
found in talking with individuals who hired private attorneys
Right.
is that at the departmental level, that first round of appeals, the informal appeal, it is usually a $10,000 bill to pay it.
I'm sorry, what Vermonter?
Well, not
Write a check, I don't think so.
Not many.
No?
Not many. If you appeal it through the up to the Human Services Board, you can spend $30,000 to $50,000 doing that. And what we've found is that if you're going to do an investigation correctly, and you're really going to challenge an appeal, an attorney who's capable of doing that has to charge that much money, because that's what it costs them in their time.
Right.
And we've had some of these appeals that have gone 2.5, 3 years. There's one I'm working on now that's gone on for 4 years.
Wow.
And you're right, very, very few people can afford that. That raised another issue for us, which was a whole issue of social and economic justice. If you have the money to hire a competent attorney, your chances of winning are what we found in our study.
Right.
You can win all the time. If you don't have the money, the data shows you don't win.
What's bothering me, and maybe Bill can answer this, when you've been winning all of these 30 appeals, didn't anybody in the department say, hey, what's this about? Why is this happening? I don't understand why the light bulb didn't
Pat-
go off.
Pat, I think, unfortunately, I think the certainly up until very recently, the administration, whether it's commissioners, deputy commissioners, secretaries of human services, have been completely unresponsive to receipt of this information.
Ugh.
There seems to be some movement now, but I think there's a couple of things that are worth mentioning as for the folks that are listening. Larry and I both worked in the system. He oversaw all of our licensing efforts. He was involved in abuse neglect investigations and review of the same. Larry and I understand that child abuse and neglect is real in Vermont. I think I understand it as better than most, and
Right.
probably better than almost anybody, because I did it for 18 years, and 2 years before that as a district director, where I put myself in the rotation to receive emergency calls at night and weekends, so I could have a better handle on what was going on for our staff and for kids and families. And that stood me in good stead when I was the commissioner. But Larry talks about, it's a system problem, and we really don't think there's pointing fingers doesn't do a lot of good. But the fact is, when you look at some of these cases and you wonder, why would somebody do this? And sometimes, you look at a case where, the mother was found unresponsive in a car with an infant, was the basis for the substantiation. Investigation shows that she was 8.5 months pregnant. She'd been up all night with another little kid. she was sleeping in the car with her child while her husband went into the store. How the hell can you substantiate somebody for that? And how can you not know that she's not, some drug abusing mom who's unconscious? It's pretty easy if you check it out. So you look at something like that and you think, well, maybe it's kind of a new person, not fully trained yet, kind of a little bumbling, But then you run across cases where the first case I was involved in with Larry that we looked at, mother is on her way to being substantiated because her child came home with a bruise from school, a little girl, first grade. How'd you hurt yourself? I bumped into, sliding down a hill, bumped into something, got a bruise. Next day, knock, knock, it's DCF. We have a report of abuse. She says, yeah, she has a bruise on her back. She told me she hurt herself sledding. Little girl says, I hurt myself sledding. Social worker takes a picture of it and pressures the mother over and over. Can you think of any other way this could have happened? Which I might add is not any proper investigative technique that I ever heard of. Okay, finally, parents don't understand. She makes the big mistake. Well, we were putting a bed frame together the other day and she fell on it. Could have happened that way, although she told me she hurt herself sledding. Social worker sends the picture to a noted pediatrician for his advice about what this looks like, but the communication to the physician says, mother said that she hurt herself falling on a bed frame. That's just a damn lie, I'm sorry. The mother didn't say that. She said, she told me she hurt herself at school, okay? Pediatrician says, well, if that's what the mother says, I'd be very suspicious because I don't think you could hurt yourself falling on a bed frame. Of course, he was right in that regard because she didn't hurt herself that way.
Wow.
They substantiate the case, take that little girl into custody. Fortunately, Larry's involved and having been around for a while says, anybody talk to the school? No. Well, they said it happened at school. I think most of us would think if I didn't trust the mother and I didn't trust the little girl, maybe I should check with the school. Larry talks to the nurse who says, what are you talking about? She was sliding down the hill. 2 teachers saw her. Bumped into
Oh my God.
got a little bruise on her back. The case is overturned. 2 weeks and 3 foster homes later, that little girl comes home. It's an outrage,
Wow.
and it's not just a mistake. I'm sorry. These are individuals making some of these decisions. Some of them are just mistakes, but some of them are clearly deliberate decisions to skew the information. Sometimes it's given to a judge. Sometimes there are facts that are not true. It's a systemic problem because we're seeing varieties of this in every county of Vermont. And at the same time, we certainly know there's good people in the system working hard to protect kids and to help parents. But these other things are going on, and we believe they're harming at the very least hundreds of children and families every year in Vermont. It is a systemic problem, and somehow an atmosphere has been created, whether it's fear of, as Larry said, somebody makes a mistake and something happens to a kid and you'll be publicly blamed, which if they're horrific incidents, of course, that people do get blamed on occasion. But, I have to tell you, as a former commissioner and a district director, you can't make decisions about families because you're afraid of what might happen to you. What if I make a mistake and they blame me? It's tough. If you made a good decision, you certainly have to know that the people you're working for will back you up. But you cannot make decisions because you're afraid that somebody might blame you if something happened. Once you go down that road, that you're making a lot of decisions that are not very good in terms of accurate. You can't make decisions based on that. And we really need to make sure that these kinds of situations aren't happening. We've seen cases some of them like this mother and her little kid, they're okay. She fled the state because she was so afraid of what might happen, but following this. But you see other cases where, it was uncomfortable and difficult, but it was corrected. But then you see others where somebody's life was completely destroyed
Right.
as a result of decisions that were not accurate, were not honest, and it's an outrage. And I hope that I hope all Vermonters of good conscience are outraged and decide to speak up with our elected officials that this has to be corrected.
Oh, I'm like feeling like a deer in
That's my
headlight. I
rant
don't
for
know.
the night. I'll
No,
turn
it's
it over to Larry.
fabulous, Bill. Thank you. Oh, go ahead, Linda.
I just, I think for the viewers, the listeners' purposes, I have some
I'm
questions.
having trouble hearing you.
I think.
Maybe put it up a little higher. It's down too low, Linda. There you go.
I can hear that.
There you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I have a couple of questions I think might be helpful for some of the listeners. Is there any type of oversight board outside who watches what's going on, who's distanced from, say, DCF? Also, what are the qualifications of those people who are doing the investigations? And where does the guardian ad litems fit in? Do they fit in at all?
Well, let me, there's a couple of ways. All systems, everybody makes mistakes. I did, you do, we all do. Systems make mistakes. And hopefully you have administrative processes, we did, where all the way up the chain of command, there was oversight. And, I talked to our former chief of operations about this, where, I would have appeals come to, in those days, I would take the appeals myself. There was no commissioner's review unit. I was the commissioner review unit. But for every case that I overturned, our chief of operations said, Bill, I sent cases back. I sent, probably 100 cases back to the district a year, because he would review them. And the district managers were, of course, doing the same thing. There was no formal process other than that appeal. But then in our legal system, you have, only the judge, supposedly, only the judge is supposed to be able to take a kid into custody, order a child into custody. It turns out the department has found a way to use voluntary care, which was intended to help parents, single mom, new to the state, no friends, needs surgery, needs help caring for her kids until she gets out of the hospital, is the case I remember as a former district director. So she signs a voluntary care agreement, but the department is at times coercing parents into signing a voluntary care agreement. It avoids going to court. State's attorneys, the department can't bring the case. The state's attorney has to bring the case. There's a check on the system. But then particularly important, kids have representation in the guardian ad litem, parents have attorneys. And really, judges don't have investigators. State's attorneys spend a lot of their time on criminal cases, and that's primarily where the investigators look. Many of them rely on DCF, and as they did when I was there, and many times. But then you have the attorneys, and ideally, the state's attorney brings the case. The judge hears from the state's attorney. He hears from the parent's attorney, from the child's attorney, balances out, makes a good decision. Except what we're finding is, with the exception for kids and parents of a handful of attorneys, I don't know how they do it and stay in business, but who are just outstanding, doing a job of representation. Most of the legal representation for kids and families is worse than worthless. It's harmful. So therefore, your checks and balances aren't working. If the judge doesn't hear anything, he assumes that what he's getting from DCF is correct. And, attorneys aren't paid enough. They're not trained well. They have too many cases. And they typically tell parents, well, you better agree with DCF and maybe you'll get your kids back quicker. And we have
So
case
to
after case where parents beg somebody to help them and they get nothing.
So to that point,
It's
that
not,
you, oops, sorry.
it's
I
not,
didn't
it's
want to
not
cut
a
you off.
justice, yeah, I'll just add, it's not a justice system.
Yeah, you brought
It's
up a
what Vermont
point.
has in mind for poor people for justice.
Yeah, the point you just said that DCF is saying you better, you better agree with DCF if you want your kids back. So is that like a forced type of plea agreement that they're trying to do so that it doesn't get to the judge's ruling?
That's correct.
Where we've seen that is where there's an investigation going on, okay? The social worker says, look, your kids can't stay with you until we finish this investigation. And so, you really need to sign a voluntary care agreement to place the kids in a foster home until we get this settled. And of course, that doesn't go to the court. So parents, they don't understand, and if they get pressured about it, and sometimes they're told, if you don't do this, we're going to have to take your kids into custody and you may lose them. But of course, that's not DCF's authority to do that. And what the parent doesn't realize is, I signed the voluntary care agreement, and maybe 2 weeks or 2 months later, the department files a petition through the state's attorney and goes to court to take the kids into custody in a chins matter. The judge looks at the case and says to himself, well, the kids have already been in foster care for 2 months. Sounds like there's something going on here. It may influence the judge's decision, the fact that they're already in care. And taking a kid, I did it thousands of times. There's times when kids have to come into custody. But I believe it is the most awesome exercise of power that the state can employ. We don't have a standing army. We don't have a death penalty. I think separating kids from their parents is the most serious exercise of power the state can employ, and you better do it right.
Right.
And
And
it's
using voluntary care, for example, to coerce a parent is not doing it right, and doing the kinds of things we've seen in investigations is not doing it right.
And the voluntary document that they sign, I'm assuming that there was no attorney there to explain to them what they were signing,
Just, yeah.
No,
nor was it told to them that they were signing a legal document and they were entitled to go get an attorney to understand it so that the parent can understand the gravity of this
I
situation?
think let Larry.
I think Larry's got a comment.
Yeah,
Okay.
Just some clarification.
Sorry, my
It's,
face.
Bill's close on the term. It's not the voluntary care agreement. It's a safety plan that comes into
Oh,
play.
for the child.
And
Like an
the
IEP
voluntary care agreement is a different stage. What he's describing occurs, but more often than not, there is a family safety plan that comes into place. Now, to be fair, DCF gets a report of a horrendous thing. They come in and look, and they don't know what to do with it. They're not quite sure. What's the evidence? How are we going to deal with this? So they said, let's buy some time. Let's get the family to agree to a family safety plan where the child will go to grandmother's house.
Right.
Or will go to a cousin's house or someone else's house for a period of time while we conduct the investigation. However, sometimes those things go on for months and months, and then you go back and look, and there's not much investigation that's taken place. So then and this is the experience that we've seen in this process, then there's a rush to judgment. We have to do something now because we've had this kid out of the house, this child's out of the house, or one of the adults has had to leave. I mean, we have cases where they sleep in the car at night. They sleep in a truck someplace, and most of them can't afford a hotel room for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. But I think that the heart of your question is oversight.
Right.
I have never seen any department in state government that has so little oversight in what it does. Now, there is an oversight group, But they have a very specific charge. They don't have the ability to do, as an example, what we did with this particular project. There really is no oversight of the system, and therein lies the problem. Because any of us, if we run a system ourselves and we don't have to be accountable to anyone for what we do, especially when we say it's all confidential, we can't tell you about it, the systems deteriorate. The things that are supposed to work right stop working right. That's just the nature of things. But there's no one to point that out. There's no one to say you have to fix it, and here's how it has to be fixed. Because you keep hiring people that keep the system running. You're not hiring people to come in and fix the system.
Well, and my next question, based upon what you just, cleared up for me and for the viewers, there's also no compliance program in there. They have a checklist, but there's really no compliance distinct.
No.
Where there's, how can you actually have a system that works without having a compliance policy and details with oversight and the interaction of the various operating managers and commissioners and so on, and where does the buck stop? Because what I heard, Bill, was you were the person who was actually having to make final decisions, which could also put you in the witness seat. And you don't want that. The person who's making the final decision to override something that's happened shouldn't also be the person who becomes the witness in the case.
Right.
Nothing wrong. I'm just saying that's because there's no oversight.
Well, there is no organized entity that's charged with looking at each program.
Exactly.
So, as an example, we have the auditor of accounts in state government.
Right.
But the auditor of accounts there is no auditor for DCF or even for some other programs.
Right.
But particularly, there is no group that is outside of the structure that comes in and says, okay, why are you doing this way? Do you understand the implications? Have you tested this system out? So as an example, this process that we have today, the substantiation process, the current system has been in place for well over 20 years. This was the first time anyone ever did a deep dive into it.
Well, thank you.
And this is a tiny, tiny nonprofit that did this. But the reality is we were able to do it. We were able to do it because my predecessor, Trina Beck,
I see.
was really, really good. And she is really good. And she built a foundation for the organization that said, our job is not only to help families, it's to test the system. That's what we do. And that's what our first report did. It's 140 pages maybe, more than almost anyone has ever read. But if you read it, you see all of the flaws that are in the system. And we pointed those out in 2018. To date, no one has refuted anything in that report. And I don't think anyone has fixed any of the things.
You've also stated you've provided recommendations to fix it, and you even said that most of what you recommended wouldn't cost anything. It's just fix it.
That is correct.
There's no money. You're not looking for any money to. It can be fixed easily.
And the places where it would cost money to do it, savings could be obtained in some of the reforms in other places to balance it out. And lo and behold, the federal government is making money available to Vermont if we make some of these changes. And other states around us are making them, and we aren't.
All right, now you're really pressing buttons. Who's not listening? What about the legislature? What about who's not paying attention? Is the governor aware of this?
Well, I should make a further point here before we get to that. If you want to talk about money, I looked at states that have implemented using federal money, many of them, model systems of legal representation for kids and parents, oftentimes with a whole lot of support services around things like housing, substance abuse, poverty, other issues, homelessness. associated with the legal representatives to help parents that they're representing. In one of the states, speaking of money, and I can't remember which one, I've got it in my file somewhere here, a fairly large state, they feel that they reduce the number of children in custody, the number of child days in custody by 50%. So, just by providing good representation, catching these kind of mistakes or situations before they had a chance to become mistakes, and correcting them and reducing the number of kids in custody. And there was no increase there wasn't any greater re-abuse in those cases than there were in the old system. So it wasn't putting kids at risk. This isn't about saving money, but the fact is, if you do this right, all these kinds of things that are happening that we're seeing will result, but many of them won't happen. Kids won't come into custody to make them home earlier. And if you want to talk about money, there are millions of dollars involved in that process that I believe don't need to be spent. And on the other hand, with what we're seeing, I'll tell you, the state is at high risk of some significant liability. Right. And there's lawsuits that have been filed. There's others coming down the pike. And boy, I'll tell you, when you start talking about things like wrongful taking of children,
right?
We saw a case out of the Carolinas. I think it was about a $42 million penalty imposed by the court. The state is really at high risk of serious liability. I mean, that isn't what motivated us to get involved in this. It's what's going on with kids and families. But if you want to talk about money, there's a lot of issues and a lot of costs related to this that are unnecessary, aside from the fact that it's also harming families.
Right.
Yeah, and let me add that a couple of things. To be completely fair to DCF, as an example, there are efforts in DCF to try to address many of the things that we found. There's going to be legislation that will be introduced this session. I fully expect that DCF will support at least some of those legislative addresses that because they recognize they're tied. Example, the reasonable person standard, the standard that almost nobody uses in the country anymore, that's in statute. They don't have a choice. Now, they could have redefined in their mind what reasonable person is. They could have said a reasonable person is a person who asks for evidence. But that's not the way the system evolved. And so we tend to live with what is in place and not change it. Notification, as an example, you're substantiated.
Right.
No one tells you during the investigation, at least up until the present time, and I'm hoping that it's happening now, no one tells you that you're going to be notified by first-class mail, that you have to keep your address up to date with the department, because the statute says that the way the department is to notify you is by first-class mail. Now, for those of us who have been in Vermont for a while, not even getting to the people who were born and raised here, when I first moved here, when you put an envelope in the mailbox for a Vermont address, it got there the next day.
Right.
It didn't matter where it was going, it got there. Today, it can take 5 or 6 days. I received some things from Waterbury, as an example, that have taken 5 or 6 days from the postmark on it. The statute says a person has 14 days within which to appeal if they've been substantiated. Well, if you lose 4 or 5 days for the mail coming, and it's going to take 4 or 5 days to go back, you better appeal the day you get that letter.
Right.
The families in trauma may very well have had children removed. The parents may be split up because they're not allowed to be in the same home, and you get this letter in the mail and you're supposed to pay attention to it.
Right.
And if you miss it by a day, you lose all of your appeal rights.
Wow.
There is no place to appeal to. That's in the statute. It says 14 days. So it's not just DCF, and it's not just people in DCF not doing the right thing. it's a system that doesn't work. There really is, from what our perspective and what you see in the report is, there isn't any part of the system that works. But it's a system, it's a bureaucracy. And changing that is virtually impossible for the average person who works in the bureaucracy.
Wow.
And that's the reason that the legislature has to play a role in this process.
Right.
Because it's the legislature that creates the law. And I think what we're going to see in proposed legislation are very reasonable changes. They're all borne out in this
Right.
study.
And they were excellent recommendations, and you can see the reason for them, and I really commend you. But all the changes you're talking about can easily be fixed through the legislature.
They can, the system pieces can be
Right.
fixed in the
Right.
legislature, and then it's going to require not just DCF, but it's going to require the Human Services Board, it's going to require the Defender General's Office, who contracts with attorneys who assist parents and children. It's going to require managerial changes as far as how the programs are managed, and it's going to require some cultural changes.
Right, and training, I'm a hope.
Absolutely, it will require training,
Yeah.
because what will be expected of investigators once the standard of evidence changes is much, much more than what they're required to know now.
Right.
And what we found in many of the cases is that the investigator doesn't understand the law. So they look at something and say, looking at our policy, which is broad,
Right.
this must be abuse. When you go to the statute, it isn't abuse.
Huh.
The problem is, the moment you're substantiated, it's like Alice in Wonderland. You go down the rabbit hole.
Rabbit hole, right.
And getting back is incredibly difficult.
Right.
The other piece that I would add to this is that we have two systems operating differently, but it's a different two systems than I spoke of a while ago. You can have a family that, as Bill described, an investigator gets a report, looks at a situation, says, oh my God, I think that there's a problem here. I think this child is abused or neglected, and I think the court needs to be involved. So an affidavit is written. That affidavit identifies the things the investigator and their supervisor believe might be happening. Those are the same things the person can be substantiated for. So the family goes into court, and after a period of 3 months, 6 months, a year and a half, the court decides there was no basis for this. There's no evidence that that occurred. And you go, great, it's finally resolved. Now the kids have been traumatized, the parents have been traumatized. However, over on this side, the DCF substantiation process is still going forward, because it doesn't matter to it what happened in court. It's a separate process. So you go into those hearings and you say, the court has said it didn't happen. Your first round of appeals is with an appeals reviewer who says, well, yeah, but that was the court. They have a different standard. A reasonable person would think it probably did happen.
Wow.
Now, I'm not kidding, but that's not a people problem. That's a system problem.
Right.
Because the system tells that reviewer, you're not allowed to reinvestigate. You have to base your decision on the paperwork the department has given you and whatever somebody brings in addition. So if we don't change the system, we're not going to get a different outcome.
No,
You could replace every human being in the system. Put all new people in, it's not going to make any
Yeah,
difference.
I don't even, it doesn't sound
And
like
it's,
due
you know,
process
when you
happens.
think about it, when you think about it, it's there are these bizarre characteristics to the system. You know, a judge says, I'm dismissing this. You've got no evidence. Come back when you've got evidence. Otherwise you're wasting my time. Case dismissed, okay? The department says, well, we're substantiating you and putting you in the registry. And you say, wait a minute, the judge said there's no proof to find that I abused my child. They say, well, yeah, but the judge uses a preponderance of the evidence and we use a reasonable person standard, so it's a different standard. So you have these bizarre systems,
Right. And Bill, once you
standards
get,
that are built in at different levels that make no sense. And it's the
Right.
same thing with the the, the appeals system. The department, you're appealing to the commissioner's review, you get your records, they're redacted, okay? Sometimes they're redacted so much you can hardly tell what it means, okay? And they're using the reasonable person standard, but when you appeal to the Human Services Board, they use a preponderance of the evidence standard and you get your whole record, unredacted. What?
Yeah.
How does this make any sense at all?
And it's because the
So
statutes,
you run into this
Yeah.
all the
Yeah.
time.
and it's because that's what the statutes call for. So when you talk about, say, cost savings, the Commissioner's Register Review Unit, by statute, is supposed to provide you a hearing within 35 days of your request.
Right.
When we started this project, they were a year and a half behind.
Wow.
But because there's no penalty in the statute and there's no accountability, it didn't matter.
Right.
But if that person missed the 14 days by a single day, they lost
They're
their,
out.
they lost their appeal. But the redaction, as an example, that's a document that has to be sent and someone has to go through it and take out every personal identifier that's in there. So sometimes you'll have, say, 12 or 14 pages, 6 of which are totally blank.
Right.
You can't see them. The question is, why? Why do we waste the time and the money doing that and delay the hearings? It's because the statute says it has to be a
there you go.
redacted document.
There you go.
Redacted document.
And so that's the catch is, and that's what we tried to point out here, that again, I keep coming back to, it's a system that currently traumatizes children,
Yep.
traumatizes parents, and it's just broken, and it needs to be fixed.
I do have to stop you because we're running out of time. Could you please tell people where they can see this report online?
Sure, they can go to www.vtprc. It's www.v as in Victor, T as in Tom, P as in Paul, R as in Romeo, C as in Charlie, .org.
Right.
That's our webpage, and the report is called Broken System, Broken Promises. And it's a merciful, I think, 41 pages.
Yeah.
And I
Oh,
say
yeah.
merciful because the other was like much bigger than that.
Right.
But it tells you what
Right.
it tells you in a much more articulate way what we're trying to describe here. And what I think works so well with the report is we describe each of the cases.
I do have to cut. I can't thank you both enough. You have our complete support, and I hope we can help you get some attention to this. Thank you for listening. We're counting on you. This is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont. We'll see you next week. Bye.